Hi, this is Levi Jones. So glad that you could join us for this opportunity to have conversations around preaching with my friend Yvette Massey, the Reverend Dr. Yvette Massey. She just recently defended on her doctoral dissertation and passed with flying colors, which is not a surprise if you know Yvette at all. She's a tremendous preacher and a wonderful friend, and just delighted to have her this afternoon to talk about preaching. So thank you for joining me, Yvette.
Thank you so much, Levi.
I'd love for you to just kind of introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about your ministry and what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me just say how honored I am that you have invited me to this space. Currently, I serve in the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church. My position is Associate Director for the Center for Congregational Excellence. And basically, that's a big, long word or phrase that means our church development office. And so basically our job is to come alongside churches and to help them live into who they feel they should be. My particular portfolio consists of things like Black church development, innovation, and church revitalization. So I have programs such as Healthy Church Initiative, Next Faithful Steps. We do a program called MLab, which is Movement Learning Action Board. And basically what we do is take participants through a series of learnings that help them prototype an idea or generate an idea, prototype an idea, and then implement it. And it's really a great program that we have, and I share that program with one of my colleagues. In addition to that, I do a lot of preaching, I do a lot of church training, we do church consultations, staff retreats, and then we fill in supply for pulpits.
That's great. And not to mention, you spent, I believe, some number of years working as a nurse in the medical field, right?
I did. Prior to going into ministry, I was a registered nurse. So yes.
A person of many talents, for sure. I will say, in our time together as students in the Doctor of Ministry program and preaching, you were one of my favorite preachers to listen to. And I still remember a particular sermon where Sarah laughed, and that sermon has stuck with me. Just the way you laughed in that sermon brought it to life. And so one of my favorite memories of our time together, but just a gifted preacher.
Thank you.
So I know that you are in your position, you're working with a lot of different pastors and preachers, and as such, you kind of get the 30,000 foot view, that offers. So I'm interested in hearing about, some shifts in preaching that you're watching, seeing. What is it that you see right now, especially with, the pandemic, how that has shaped preaching and what you're seeing as some of the changes?
You know what, Levi, we are in such a wonderful time. Part of me thinks, oh, Lord, I'm so glad I'm not a pastor of a local church. And then my other mind says, oh, I wish I was a pastor of a local church, because this is just such a wonderful opportunity to walk alongside the people of God. And you're right, because of the pandemic, because of sheltering in place, because we've had to make so many changes differently, quickly, we do see something shifting, especially as it relates to preaching. Obviously, one of the things that's shifting is the platform. We're used to being in church, in front of a pulpit, in front of, a crowd of people, and delivering a message where there is some type of energy, some type of give and take. But now people are finding that they have to go to Zoom or conference calls or some other digital medium in order to deliver the word. And because they're in a different medium, it has caused a shift in style. And because of the reason that we are now in a different medium, it's causing a shift in content. Whereas pastors, and they still do, had the freedom to use the lectionary, use the hottest book or the best movie to make an illustration or analogy that flows throughout a sermon, or could focus solely on what's going on in that local church. Now, because of where we are, pastors are finding that there's a very specific thing that needs to be preached, and that is hope, that is assurance, that is direction, that, those things often were in sermons before the pandemic, but now it's much more concentrated, much more purposeful in bringing those things out in the preaching moment. And then style. Now, I do recognize that style, goes with community, goes with the culture of the church. But for example, in the African-American community, many pastors possess a lot of charisma, when they're preaching. And there's this huge, give and take, and there's volume, there's crescendos, there's rhythm. Whereas the digital medium that most of us are having to use immediately does not translate that well. And so we're having to, change the style in which we're delivering the word and offer people a lot more comfort for a lot longer time than perhaps we would have prior to the pandemic. So those are just a few things that have shifted, since we've been in this.
Yeah. I think pastoral care has certainly been something that has been right at the very sort of forefront of at least my mind when I've been preaching, and I think that's true for my wife as well. We co-pastor, and so trying to provide pastoral care even in the preaching moments to bring about, as you mentioned, assurance and hope. But one of the things that you were mentioning, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking as you were talking about Kenyatta Gilbert, and he talks about the trifocal preacher, and he talks about, we speak from the prophetic lens, the priestly lens, and the sagely lens, but oftentimes we're in that priestly vein, what you should not do. But we're finding now that there has to be a lot more of that prophetic lens that brings in the good news of grace. There's a lot more of that sagely lens where we're offering wisdom from the text, but also drawing on wisdom of the community. Those are some other shifts that are, taking place as well.
Yeah, reminds me of Frank Thomas's statement of the wisdom of the ages.
Yes.
Preaching. Yeah, very good. One of the things you were mentioning is the dynamic of the give and take in any congregation that you're preaching to, whether that's a very vocal response or a more reserved response. There's some kind of give and take in the preaching moment between preacher and congregation. And with the distance that technology brings in that preaching moment, how are you seeing people either responding to that or inviting participation when it does seem like the energy is difficult? I'm preaching basically to a wall when I'm in my dining room. It's a very odd thing. Or even watching myself on camera while it's happening, as we're recording, it's kind of odd to see yourself while you're doing it. And it doesn't provide much energy or responsiveness. So how are pastors responding to that, bringing or inviting participation?
We just sent out a survey in our conference, the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, asking pastors how they were doing. And many of them talked about the challenge of preaching to a wall, or preaching to my cell phone, or preaching to an empty room. And, in preaching, there's already a level of distance that we have to try to overcome to connect with our congregations. And so one of the ways that, we're seeing this is where pastors are having a digital pastor or a chat host while they are on these digital mediums in worship or in Bible study. And so basically the role of that person is to engage those who are online. Some churches had already begun to engage in this when they were in the sanctuary, because they found that when they were doing specific things in the sanctuary, such as, taking up an offering or some type of announcements, there was dead space in the digital platform or in the cyber campus. And so they began to do things to engage them, to keep them connected while those things were going on in the church. Now that, very few people, if any, are in church right now, we're seeing a rise on that digital pastor or that chat host, which invites persons to begin in conversations to get to know them. Now, it could be something as simple as, hey, welcome, we're glad you're here, give us your name and your email so that we can follow up with you. And I hope that they actually are. It's also, hey, like and share our page, or if there's a specific theme that the pastor is talking about, they begin to engage the people online about that. Where have you seen, the grace of God? What's your biggest concern right now? And then begin to offer words of hope. But another thing is we're seeing churches begin to figure out how to be the church in the community when we can't get close because of social distancing. So we're seeing some innovative ways that churches are connecting. Like, for example, we have a pastor in our conference when it's coming up to Easter. Many churches do Easter egg hunts. And so what they did was a virtual Easter egg hunt. They had it on their Facebook page on their website. And they invited, the congregation and anyone to participate in it. And the most interesting thing is that there were more adults playing the game, than there were children. We've had pastors who, tried to make a connection. One pastor said she's a tree hugger, and she took pictures of her members and people who connected with them digitally who were willing to send a picture. And she put them on trees and telephone poles around her house or near their house. And she went out and hugged it and took a picture. And that was a virtual hug, from their pastors. Another youth pastor went out and she hid things, in a park. And this was before we had the 100% shelter in place. And she invited the community to go out and find those things, but not pick them up. It was a scavenger hunt. Take a picture of it and then come back and post it. All of those type of things provide a way of connection and helps to form this new beloved community. And so, we may think that doesn't amount to much, but in a time where you can only touch those who are in your home, you can only really see up close and feel reasonably safe with those who are in your home, you'd be amazed at what type of connection and community things like that are able to build.
That's good. Yeah, one of the things I was also thinking about as somebody who is currently preaching to a camera, and usually my wife or I are, off to the side, and we're about the only people that are listening to it in the moment that it's actually being preached. The question comes up, who is the actual audience of a sermon? Theologically, I think we are reminded that God's word is spoken to us, but then is spoken back to God. And in that whole cycle, we are caught up in this intertrinitarian life. So the sermon in and of itself, the audience has always been God. And it's also communicated to humanity as well, but they're not necessarily always they're not the end of the sermon, so to speak. Always going back to God in sort of this lived discipleship. And so maybe that could be helpful for us in thinking about some different theological frameworks for this preaching moment. How do we preach, and who are we preaching to? And I want to say, in some ways, it's always from and back to God that our preaching, our words are given and received, or maybe reverse that, received and given in praise and adoration, regardless of who hears ultimately. And so the task is just to be faithful in the moments, not always creative and innovative, but to be faithful.
And that is so important. And in thinking of the cycle that you just mentioned, I think that we also have to be intentional about those who, if I may use the word, overhear or listen in to the message. Because when we're in our congregation, we function from the privilege of knowing those people to a degree who are before us, where they are spiritually, where they need to grow. And we have an idea of what we can say to be instruments of the Holy Spirit so that that growth can begin to take place. But because now we have so many who are on this digital medium, we have to prepare for that. Was working with a pastor doing her first Bible study, and she wanted to do it on Facebook. So, okay. And we began to talk about language, because much of her language was very churchy. And one of the things that I, wanted to encourage her to realize was that once you get on that medium, it's no longer just your congregation, and it's no longer just for that moment. It's out there for a long time, and people who you won't dream of will be able to access that. So then we have to be mindful of, the language that we use, that it doesn't present a barrier to people understanding the message and the faithfulness to that message that we're trying to present. It really makes me think of what John Wesley said, the world is my parish, for real now. And so we have to construct those messages as such so that the world can understand it. We can't assume that there is a level of understanding, because as we know, we're living in a time where this is, we have the most unchurched or de-churched or nominally church people. So we can't assume that they know things that our congregations would automatically know. So yes, ultimately, God is the audience, but there's something that God is desiring to do in us and through us and in those who are also hearing and participating, in this, that we have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yeah, and even to think about the context of who's listening or overhearing. I like that. Overhearing our messages, and because right now probably the majority of us are not able to sort of differentiate between the ages, like we might. Some churches might do that more often, where they have an age specific, worship service or something, children's church, whatever. And so they would kind of dissect those off and have one for the adults and then one for the children that could be more age specific or, kind of appropriate. Maybe that might be a way of thinking of it. But in the context that we're in now, you have those families that are together in that preaching moment. And so you're not just speaking to, a 30 or 40-year-old, you might be speaking to somebody who's 5 or 10 years old as well. And so finding ways that your language can be clarified and intentional and well thought out so that it's communicating to the breadth of those that might be engaging in whatever capacity they can. So are there any things that you would suggest in that preaching moment to be able to reach across those sort of broad spectrums or levels of understanding? What would you suggest a preacher do to help facilitate that?
I'm glad that you brought that up, because as you were speaking, I was thinking one of the drawbacks to this time is that we see many pastors who would ordinarily delegate and share with their team have become solo heroic pastors. They've become the preacher, the videographer, the editor, the technician they've become, and if not the pastor, then the pastor's spouse. And when we do that, we find that we may miss those areas that you just mentioned. I think this is a beautiful time for the pastor to engage in generative leadership. Rather than being the solo who delivers it all, tap people in the congregation who can help facilitate that message. And it may not be the normal people that you would tap, but people who have skill sets specific for this time. With that said, I think that I would recommend pastors still continue to work with those in their church who were over those specific age group ministries. Several of our churches are still doing children's sermons in the midst of the sermon. Now, granted, we have to keep in mind that the bandwidth for online worship is probably 30 minutes, 45 if you've really got the people's attention. But having a segment in there for the children. I remember watching one service, and there were two ladies who were over this particular children's ministry, and they were sitting on the floor at the altar, because that's where they did the filming for the service, and they had a specific children's moment. And I think things like that are important, because in one sermon, when we were physically in the same space, it was difficult to hit all those different age groups. And so with a shorter amount of time and all of the other nuances that come with digital delivery, it's going to be even more difficult to do so. So I would recommend making sure that you have something specific for children and youth, if not in that precise moment, that some point during the week, someone, if not the pastor, is engaging those groups. But then again, I would say now just drop the ecclesial language. Speak plainly to people. Make it less of a production and more of an authentic delivery, authentic engagement with the word and with those that you would imagine are listening to you. I know part of the reason why we try to stay so close to the church, because that can become our point of connection. But because there are so many different people, so many different age groups, I think those that are being the most successful are those who are just doing a heart to heart. And when we're speaking authentically like that, it's amazing what children can pick up and understand. It's amazing how well youth and young adults can jump right in there and glean something from that message. So that would be what my suggestion would be.
Yeah, and to be honest, because most of us are probably not necessarily extremely tech savvy, and trying to edit things, it is cumbersome to say the least. Not to mention we probably don't have all the tools that would be helpful to make it even more efficient. So if that's the case, be planning ahead rather than trying to do it within a couple days turnaround. If you want to include, like, for one thing that Pastor Becca has done is invite some families to say, like, the Lord's Prayer, so we can clip that in and put it in as part of our regular prayer. When we had Easter, we had families that would send in a video that said, he is risen indeed, hallelujah, and then we put all those.
We did that.
Yeah, so, but that takes time and energy, and so, be thinking maybe 2 or 3 weeks out as you're planning, rather than trying to do it in, like, I've got 3 days left, what can I do to try to incorporate people into it.
There's another thing that's seeming to develop in our conference, and that is collaboration among pastors. Now, granted, we preached every Sunday, except our vacation Sundays, but what we're finding is that pastors are exhausted. And part of it is just the stress of this pandemic. But what we're finding is collaboration or cooperative experiences where they're coming together and creating a worship service. Like, for example, now we're in, the Easter tide, where we're going from Easter to Pentecost. And so this one particular district that we were working with have developed a whole sermon series, and they're going to have different preachers come in, and what the surrounding pastors can do in that district, they can either take this whole service and just use it and worship with their congregation, or they can pull pieces out and embed it into their congregation so that there's less for them to think about. And then they're also doing the same thing with the Bible study. They're doing the same Bible study, and they're going to upload it so that all of these churches can come together and have that experience. Not only does it build community, but it allows you to get ahead and not have to deal with so many of the nuances that perhaps you're just now learning to do. And we did that. Christ is risen indeed. We had a virtual choir where someone put together several people singing, and it's there. We did offerings, and I had talked to someone today who said, can we use the offering? Yes, the resources are there. Please, by all means, go ahead and use them. So yeah, to invite them in to do different parts of the service. We have people who have greeters still, and they are ones who record a greeting, and it's embedded into the worship service. So there are lots of ways to connect and engage your people.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we were talking, I know, in a previous conversation recently about the sort of exhaustion level of pastors. And then trying to preach out of a sense of exhaustion is it's sometimes impossible. It's just really a difficult thing. Preaching on a good day is hard, but add exhaustion on top of that, and then trying to be creative and to think clearly and put something together that makes sense and is connected to the text, and then also really speaking to the needs of people is just, that's a large task. So are there any sort of things that you would say as a pastor, a pastor that may be experiencing exhaustion and is still, hasn't maybe had all the connections to be able to share preaching with others, is still having to do that? What kinds of things they could begin to do or implement that might help them cope with some of that exhaustion and still be creative, and anything like that you would suggest?
The first thing I would suggest actually does not immediately relate to preaching, but we both know it impacts preaching, is take time to rest. You know, one of the things that we do get out of this is opportunity to slow down. By no means do I believe God has done this, meaning created this pandemic, but I do think that God is able to use it to give us an opportunity to slow down, to return to God, to nurture our faith and our spirits by resting. But many pastors are, you know, I gotta figure this out. I gotta figure this out. I gotta get, you know, and they're just spinning their wheels. You know, just take time to rest and to breathe. And now I'm going to say something that a professor that we had together, Jennifer Brooks, would probably crucify me for. But you use a sermon that you've already prepared. If you have something that speaks to this moment that can offer hope and assurance and direction, use it. Because oftentimes, unless it's just a humdinger of a sermon, people aren't going to remember every nuance of the sermon. Okay. And so use that. That gives your mind a break from having to try to come up with something right away each week in the midst of the stress of trying to minister to your congregation, especially if they're impacted by coronavirus or COVID-19 and you can't physically get to them. This buys you a little more time. Additionally, who else can you work with in your church to delegate some of these things that will give you time to prepare your word? If there is something that you can give, you know, if you have small groups, have somebody else take care of that. If you have children and youth workers, have someone else to take care of those things so that you are not doing everything alone. And hopefully that will give you some space to have time to rest and prepare your sermon that you're going to share for that week or the next week to come. And then you said it earlier, even in our planning time, plan for further out and not just for the moment. Right. And oftentimes we encourage people to use series, because if there's a series, then you already have a foundation to build upon when you go to that next sermon. And when you have series, that takes away that trying to figure out, oh, what am I going to preach? Which text, you know, do I do lectionary? Do I do topic? You know, it kind of gives you a place to start. So those are just a few things that I would offer.
Yeah, those are great. You know, one other or a couple additional thoughts, because of you know, the possibility of just really being very stationary a lot, and I think exercise, getting out, walking, you know,
Yes.
thing,
Yes.
self-moving, you know, that's important, as well as
Yes.
being able to rest, actual good sleep. I'm not always the best at that, but I think it's something that I notice a difference in my ability to be creative when I'm rested in that kind of way as well.
Yes.
But the other piece I would say, there's a John Cleese video, and I'll probably get in trouble for mentioning this, but there's a great presentation on John Cleese talking about creativity. You can find it on YouTube. It's like an hour-long lecture where he just goes through and talks about this one joke. It's the same joke over and over, just slightly different. And he changes a few elements in it, and it's funny as he goes through it. And he's just talking about the process of creativity, and he says that time is an essential piece of creativity. And I know many of us probably feel overwhelmed and don't have much margin for time, but I would say spend time. You have to set some time apart to be able to sit, think, and also time to get in the mode of thinking. So, you know, that takes 20 or 30 minutes sometimes to just be able to kind of shut other things off and really begin to concentrate. But one of the things that we also did in our program that I've found extremely helpful is inviting other people from the congregation to be congregation partners in the preaching development. So, hey, I'm going to be preaching on, you know, Thomas when he touches invited to touch the wounds of Jesus's hands. Let's sit down on Wednesday night, do a Zoom session, and just talk about what you're seeing and hearing and experiencing in these texts. Inviting those voices can be a really helpful thing so that you're not the only one that's kind of trying to be creative and think through these things. You have a whole lot of energy when there's some conversation partners.
Absolutely. I remember doing that several times with my preaching project. And it worked well, even with the children and youth, to allow them to do some word associations. I took a text out of Genesis that I thought was going to be one sermon. And by the time they got finished with it, we had 5. And so we did a series. But it had, like 3 phrases in it, and they broke it down so that I thought, oh my goodness. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Another thing though, and I think we may have talked about this in our program, is taking advantage of play.
Yes.
Taking time, and I have a cohort of preaching women that I work with, and we had someone to come in and share with us, and she started asking questions like, what's the last song you listened to? What's the last book you read? The last movie? When's the last time you had fun? And she talked about how when you are at a point where you just have lost creativity, if you get up and, do something that's not related to that, not related to church work, that then makes a space for creativity to come back in. So that's something else that you can do. Just do something fun, do something different.
Yeah.
Read a different book that's not related to preaching or Bible study. Watch a movie you've always wanted to watch. Play with the kids. Walk the dog. Something like that.
Or even just go listen to other great preachers. I mean, there's a lot of resources, and sometimes they can spark some creativity. Gardner C. Taylor or whoever. But Sunday. I imagine the old adage goes, Sunday comes every 3 days, and I feel like now is probably like every 2 days.
Right.
But in order to get to the place of a sermon, you have to do it in an unhurried kind of way. And so sometimes, reading a text on Sunday or maybe Saturday, if you preach on Saturday, read the text and just let it sit and just kind of ruminate on it. And, things come to you even when you're not concentrating on the sermon. You've read that text 3 or 4 times in a setting and listened at different angles, and then just let it sit. And don't be in a hurry to get a production done, but allow that time for prayer. And I think right now we're in a place where prayer is not just an option, but just a necessity. And so this is an opportunity for us to really put into practice the things that we're always proclaiming. Don't be in a hurry. Be a time of rest. Be a time of prayer, and also preparation as we are allowing God to gestate in us. Something that'll give new life to our congregation and to us, I think.
That's something that I had to learn. And I also recognize that people prepare sermons in different ways. We're taught that, by Wednesday or Thursday, you should have your sermon. But I know several pastors where it just simply doesn't click until Friday or Saturday. And so I would encourage, while we can always learn better practices, if that's who you are, live into it, because sometimes trying to do something else creates more stress that then inhibits creativity. The other part of that is I do like what you said about reading the scriptures and just letting it sit, because what I had to learn is as I have read that scripture and then I'm just meditating on it, in the back of my mind while I'm working or, at the grocery store when we were able to go out, but while we're just moving around, in our homes, you will begin to live it. You'll begin to, oh, you know what, that happened. And it gave me insight into this text. And you begin to get fodder that you can use, or at least if it doesn't actually end up in the sermon, it gives you an idea or takes you to a place to where you can help prepare what you're trying to get out of the word or what God is trying to give you out of the word. So I guess I just want people to recognize that it doesn't have to be such a formal preparation. There is a time for exegesis. There is a time to get into the commentaries. There is a time to, write your manuscript or get your outline out, but try to spend time living it, breathing it, just sitting with it, and let it kind of bubble up to the top.
Right. Yeah. Anything else that you feel would be just important for preachers to be thinking about in this particular moment, whether that's about what we're preaching, how we're preaching, anything like that you think would be valuable?
I think, we can't say enough about the message of the sermon, delivering the good news. As pastors, I know that we are overwhelmed, and some pastors use as a strategy to try to help the people see that we're human too, by letting the people see our concern, to see our stress, but I would encourage pastors to move away from that and perhaps, share that in our clergy groups or, with your counselor, but take the opportunity to share the good news. Dr. Brooks talks about the good news is the assurance of grace. It's God's action. What is God doing in this time to save and bless God's people? Word, like a message like that, because that's what people are looking for. They're trying to find some hope. They're trying to find some help. They're trying to find a reason to hold on, because everybody's life has changed. I was a nurse. Now I'm a nurse and I'm a homeschool teacher. I don't know how to teach my children. That's why I send them to school. I've lost my job and I've got to homeschool these kids. Or now I have my parents in my home. So I have my parents and my kids. And, everybody's life has changed. Everybody is under stress and everybody is experiencing loss. And that's one thing I want to make sure that we as pastors keep in mind. And whether that's loss from someone who has actually been impacted by COVID-19, or just the loss of normalcy. And with any type of loss comes grief. Yes. And when people are grieving, everything is magnified, and now it's probably times 10,000. So people aren't responding the way they normally would because nothing is normal. So take that into consideration when you are crafting that sermon, and make sure you look in that text and find that good news, find that assurance of grace, find that assurance that God is with us, and find a way to communicate that to the people so that they can continue to hold on, because we will come out of this. It won't be exactly as it was. I think that's gone. We're going to be living in a new time, a paradigm shift. We will get out of our homes, but it will be different. So until then, what are you offering the people to help them till God brings the change? That's what I would offer.
Amen. Yeah, I think if we can end on what God is doing, has done, and will do in the future, that's a good place for us to end in our sermons. Yeah, so thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to sit down and talk about preaching with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. And I just want to just say how proud I am of you and just how blessed I am to have met you and your beautiful family, and just to share, the Actually Men program experience with you. I have learned so much from you, and I just bless God for what you are doing in this ministry.
Well, thank you, Yvette. Same to you.